of what is there for us in Capital for Marx is really what I wanted to try and come away with. If you were to ask me, what's the simplest definition of Marxism I could come up with? It would be, Marxism is the history of reading Marx. And that history really means that you have to come to Marx with a reason, with a question that you're in pursuit of. And I would say that what Capital specifically provides is the critique of capital from the perspective of labor, and therefore the opportunity to think about what otherwise seems like a naturally occurring phenomenon in a way that makes it contingent, that makes it full of contradiction, and that makes it something other than what it appears to be. And it allows us, therefore, to see both what the great continuities in the formation of capitalism, and the historic formation have been, and what some of the ruptures and discontinuities and changes and transformations have been. And so in some ways, Marxism is a vocabulary for tracking that relationship between something that allows us to return with a critical vocabulary to understand what capitalism is, and at the same time note some of its transformations. And what I want to do in visiting some of the themes, especially out of Volume 1 and Volume 3, is to get us from what sometimes is referred to as a production-oriented capital that's rooted in Volume 1 to what sometimes is referred to as a finance-oriented capital. And what's interesting is to see that Marx is already concerned with the relationship between production and finance, or production and circulation. And that is, in some ways, constitutive of his understanding, even as its terms and conditions change. And I think what we could say about precarity, which is the thematic of the intensive, is that there's never been a time, probably of human experience, but certainly of class society, that hasn't produced very historically specific forms of precarious life, right? Where violence, where some kind of exploitation, where some sort of exploitation, or some question as to what happens between people's capacity to produce their lives and and the command over that capacity, or what Marx calls the relationship between subsistence and surplus doesn't mark some kind of division in society. And we could say that in those societies where there is a social division between those who produce the subsistence and those who produce the surplus, that division is the basis of a class society. Certainly, there have been many, many kin-based societies. Sometimes they're referred to as primitive communism, where those who produce the subsistence and those who yield the surplus are the same people. In a lot of the anthropological literature, one example is a classic anthropological study written on the southern Sudan in the 1930s called The Nur by E. Evans Pritchard, which is about one such grouping. But it's also interesting to note, even in the history of how we get these records, and Marx and Engels are not outside of this. Engels, for example, in thinking about the roots of communism, relies on Morgan's League of the Iroquois, which is already wrapped up in the histories of colonialism, as is Evans Pritchard. Evans Pritchard was a British anthropologist sent to map what is now southern Sudan, in which we know there's a civil war going on. And those were the conditions, right, of the discovery, we could say, or delineation of what we know of this kind of social and cultural diversity, which is one reason why we want to be very careful about what kinds of claims can be made, about some kind of past, and why it's difficult just to say that past is available to us to return to or to have. And sometimes I think that's an invocation of some idea of a primitive communism, as if we could strip away what we have and return to some more direct, authentic, immediate forms of human social relations. And I think that, on the other hand, what is intriguing about thinking about the society that we live in which the name that we give to that society is not surplusism, or even, more properly, what is it that makes for surplus? It's people being pressed together. And if we're talking about what we call our society, which is curiously, we name ourselves not after, it's not called populism, peopleism, humanism, or probably more properly, the ism of the social. Because the one thing we could say about the tendency of societies is that as we've seen societies emerge at increasingly global scales with increasing degrees of interdependency, and with that interdependency doesn't mean that wealth is shared, but it does mean that it is produced at a global scale. Right? So one thing we could say is that there's a disavowal. What capital does is it disavows the social foundations that it rests upon. So the paradox of even understanding ourselves from the perspective of capital, rather than either of labor, the social, or as Marx begins the book Capital, the wealth of societies, is something that should not be lost on us. And we have to appreciate that it is an ongoing political achievement of capitalism to say not just the wealth, but society itself rests upon what he calls the prevalence of capital. And what is capitalism? Marx has a very straightforward, that turns out to be rather complex, takes 3 volumes of this book. And it's interesting. You could say, oh my goodness, that guy's a commie, right? So why didn't he call his book, Commies Are Us? Or, Socialism Forever? Or, but why does he start with capital? And the simple reason that we'll see is that if capital is the source of wealth, what he wants to show is that what lies beyond capital is already within it, or what we could call an immanent critique. So what he's really doing, then volume 1 is called a critique of political economy. The political economy, going back to Adam Smith and Ricardo, was the account of how it was that society produced wealth. And we could say that the big promise of capitalism is out of scarcity would come abundance through an increasing division of labor, through producing what Smith called the wealth of nations. Right? So Marx is transposing that in the opening line of Capital to the wealth of society. Okay. So the question is, how do we make a claim on that wealth so that we is constituted as a politically capable social force, movement, entity that could both politically make that claim, but also conceptually make that claim. And conceptually make that claim by understanding that the wealth is already there. Because we could say say that so much of what we now call parity is based on the manufacture of austerity. It's really interesting that, you know, this was in 2008, immediately after the bailout. Finance did not really go into crisis. Finance is not all of it, but a lot of it is happily, merrily chumming along. 20,000 people were laid off of Wall Street. A lot of hedge funds closed. But the biggest ones are bigger than ever. The richest ones are richer than ever. There's more wealth in society than ever before. So the claims that austerity is somehow a necessary feature of society, which means basically that we have to sacrifice our future to pay off present debt. And we have to keep borrowing more and more money to satisfy the demands of capital. That's what the bailout entailed. And it's interesting that in 2008, basically, the entire tax base of the United States, $15 trillion, was pledged to a handful of large investment banks and even smaller number of automobile companies without any promise of return to the people who put up the cash, the taxpayers. And in fact, the only dependency of that money was that it be returned to the government that lent it at a profit. So this is interesting how it set up the government as having the purpose of reaping revenue, as being, if you will, a closer arm of capital. So even just thinking through that means that if we challenge the conditions of austerity that make precarity so expensive in the world, the simplest challenge to that is just on the face that rather than assuming that there isn't enough money, we could say, well, there's plenty of money. There's plenty of wealth. And there's plenty of different ways of measuring that plenitude. But what it's more difficult to do is to understand what form that wealth takes and how we might make a claim upon it. Okay? And I want to suggest that the math that brings us from Volume 1 through Volume 3 of Capital starts to do some of that work. And you should just stop me at any point if there's questions about anything, about terminology, about what I'm saying. So, what is capital? Well, the simplest definition of capital is it's money that purchases some commodity in order to make more money. So MCM prime is Marx's formula for capital. And this is already, you could say, what's very clever about capitalism. Because Marx calls these different ways of producing wealth modes of production. So, for example, under the prior European mode of production to capitalism, one that capitalism emerges from, called feudalism, the direct producers, the feudal serfs, have access to their own means of subsistence. They have common lands that can't be sold. So when we talk about the commons now, we're oftentimes making reference to that particular social division where serfs had inherited rights to the land that they would farm, but it also meant that they also had means to this means of subsistence. It also means that, say, their work week was divided between something like 4 days for producing on their own lands and 2 days to produce on the land of the Lord. And that was fixed. It was fixed by a nominally extra-political force, but it was in no way extra-political because the political forces were all given from God, whether it was the king or the lords of the estates. So it was also fixed in that kind of cosmological sense, that you had to work the land of the Lord. Usury or lending money was completely sin. But it also meant that the Lord couldn't turn around and say, gosh, I really like you guys to work a little overtime for me because I'm just not getting enough, and besides which, I'd love to expand my estate here. So what they did do, the deal was, tell you what, I'm going to provide you with safety and security. It's a little bit like what we have now with the war on terror, right? We're actually, in the name of security, going to produce insecurity because we're going to go on a constant war. And if you remember your history from the Middle Ages, it was the 30 Years' War, the War of the Roses, the 100 Years' War, the Crusades. It was an ongoing militarization of society because the people who produced the subsistence also supported the labor of the military state. But it meant that internally, this relationship between subsistence and surplus was fixed. Okay. And it was transparent. You knew when you were working your common land, and it was your land, and you knew when you were working the land of the Lord. And that line, couldn't be readily moved. But that was, of course, a problem, right? European feudalism ran into a triple threat. There was drought, there was famine, because you kept trying to get potatoes out of the same land, and the land stopped being productive. And this is before Dow Chemical was rescuing us all, in Bhopal and other kinds of disastrous environmental circumstances. And that kind of pressing of people also generated things like plagues. Florence, the jewel of Western civilization in the 14th century, had a plague that wiped out 3/4 of the population. So, European civilization just about killed itself many times over. But that's just one. We think of this crowning moment of the Renaissance. Yeah.
I want to be clear. You're saying that even up to the time working 4 days, 2 days was fixed.
Yes.
For long periods, or I thought that the arbitrariness was the cause of many revolts. That the extra taxes, the extra time in time of drought, you have to work on the Lord's land, was what led to resistance against this relationship.
Yeah. So there was no doubt all kinds of renegings. There was, you could say, what was called noblesse oblige. Right, the sense of the social compact in which those relations were fixed, and all kinds of violations of that. So it's not that the law was the law and it was never violated, but the terminus of feudalism came about through two movements in France and England in the 17th and 18th centuries. One, more in France, was an increase in taxation, which became unsupportable and was a means to expropriate those common lands so that the land could be converted from agricultural production to grazing lands for sheep, because wool was the first material in the Industrial Revolution in both countries. So that took taxation and the enclosures of those lands. So that was the end point of saying, no, this is over. And that also forced feudal serfs into the cities, where they gave up that means of subsistence and became free. Free to make a wage, right, which is getting paid for their time, but also free to starve. They lost access to a means of subsistence. So all of that's to say that the transformation of capitalism was not just driven by war, but it was also internal violence. And then the doubling of that violence was then also to say, if only some portion now, instead of the entire household, participating in the production of subsistence. What wage labor meant is that now those people who had access to wage labor, and this is complex in the history of capitalism, in some cases women and children were first inscripted into the factories because they didn't have the security, they didn't have title claims, and part of the reason for that is that the subsistence was passed on to something called primogeniture, or firstborn males. Right, so it was so feudalism was gendered, but a lot of that gendering carried over. And in the circumstance of capitalism, which was never very stable because women always worked, but still, the idea of the Victorian separation between the public sphere of work and the private sphere of social reproduction, women's labor was defined as unpaid labor. And that was for the social reproduction of the entire society, the labor force, healthcare, cooking, biological needs, child rearing, all of those kinds of activities. Right? And again, just to sort of shorthand, we could say that part of what has happened to the question of social reproduction, in some ways, finance is about the social reproduction of capital as a whole. So it's not like those imprints of a gendered divide have gone away. But it does mean that some of the same phenomena of what we now call free labor, maker culture, do-it-yourself, big data, a lot of these trajectories in which people do work but don't get necessarily a direct wage, but it contributes to what are some of our largest capacities and claims on wealth. And similarly, when people are now told, well, would you like to retire? Oh, isn't that nice? Well, tell you what, you take all the risk, you manage your portfolio, you contribute monthly to what's called a defined contribution retirement account. In 1968, 2/3 of U.S. workers had what were called defined contribution retirement accounts. Right? And now that's about 7%.
Defined benefit. It was called defined benefit, right?
Yeah, defined benefit was a proportion of the wage that you had when you graduated from the workforce, right, when you retired.
Right.
That went back, and again, this impending strike from the MTA is precisely along these lines, right? That the future workers are not going to have the deal that the existing workers have. They're going to have a different future. Or another way of saying that is that future is going to be canceled. And that's what's being put on offer. But, if you will, the second shift used to be conceived of as women's work, unpaid work in the household. Now we could say that, which was about the social reproduction of labor. Now we could say that the second shift is the work of reproducing capital through finance. This is the second shift of capital. And that is very much the condition of precarity because it does not carry wage labor or any kind of the freedom takes now the form of being freed not to work but from employment. And so this is one of the, we could say, is the big term that's taking place, and it's working its way up the professional food chain, right? The idea, say, of getting access to college, and one of the many reasons why student debt is such an issue. One reason is that student debt at over $1 trillion is more than credit card debt. But the other reason is that student debt used to be justified because you became part of what was called the professional managerial class, which was the kind of reinvention of the petite bourgeoisie, the little bourgeoisie, the independent owner of capital, right? Which was one way in which capitalism achieved this political accomplishment, right? Because anybody supposedly could become their own boss, their own employer. They could become self-employed, and the way that would happen was through a credential, by having access to higher education, which would allow them to become a professional, which would give them control over their future. So what has happened really is that whether it's through the diminishment of that professional autonomy, the transformation, for example, the Affordable Care Act is as much about the amalgamation, concentration, elimination of independent professional practices and the replacement with health management organizations, as is the elimination of tenure, not simply from the professoriate. In 1970, 70% of college teachers were tenured, 30% were part-time. Now those ratios have been reversed. But now that's the pattern across the professions. It's in law, it's increasingly in healthcare. So that promise, saying, if you here's the deal. And this was Gary Becker, who died a couple months ago, idea of human capital. You invest in yourself by going into debt. Education is not a public good for democratic participation and citizenship. It's a private good. It's a return on investment. And it's interesting, in technical terms, that's still the case. People who go into debt and go to college still are projected to make about $500,000 more than their college debts. Average college debt is about $27,000, but not where I teach. At NYU, it's about 4 times that. NYU is striving to become a leading ranked university. It has one clear top ranking, and that is student debt at about $500,000. But that question of even orienting yourself towards your life as a return on a personal investment you can make doesn't then answer the question, well, what is life for? What is society for? What is labor for? What is work for? These, of course, are questions that can't be answered from within the given capital. Why? Because the capital is its own means and ends. The point of making money is making money, or what Marx called accumulation. It's a tautology, it's a circle. And I was making this relation to feudalism, right? To say that one of the things that we can now see that is clever about capitalism is that the same thing that is the basis of, or currency of subsistence, is also, if you will, the currency of surplus, right? The dollar bill, right? Although dollar bills are just one type of money, right? There's 3 kinds of money. There's dollar bills, which are a tiny fraction of the money that's in circulation. There's what's called fiat money. It's the money that's printed by the Fed. And there's credit money, which is what banks produce when they create a loan. Right? So this means that one of the things that capital does is that it integrates what produces surplus and what produces subsistence into the same form, and drives people, you could say, towards the same orientation, to say, well, if we can expand the entire mass of accumulating capital, then supposedly everybody will benefit, because there'll be more capital and people can reap the benefits of that. That's the claim. And again, what the 2008 financial bailout did was gave the lie to that claim, because there is more wealth, but there is not a way of making a claim on that wealth. If anything, just the opposite. And I think that is, if you were to say, what's the reason to be reading Marx and Capital now? that might be the simplest, although it's not simple to get into it, but reason why Marx is speaking to us today, because he's giving us a way of talking about that. And he gives us that way of talking about it from the opening line, page 1, volume 1, chapter 1 of Capital, where he says, the wealth, that's the subject, the wealth of those societies where the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities. Our analysis must begin with the simplest commodity. The wealth of those societies where the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities. So what strikes you about that sentence, about that way of opening Capital, given what we've been saying? What intrigues you about it? What questions you have? Anything? Yeah.
Well, there's no mention of things that we usually associate with wealth, like measured in money, or measured in gold, or measured in something like that.
That's right. So, right, he starts off with the wealth as an aggregate, right? It's the wealth. The whole thing, all of it, which again is, I think, something important to grasp about capital, exactly that distinction that you made between wealth as such, wealth in general, or in Marx's terms, wealth in the abstract, and wealth in its particularity, in its specificity, in its concreteness. And a lot of that opening chapter and of Volume 1 and of Marx's method is a movement between the general form and the particular specific concrete form. And a lot of what, say, something like money deals with is how you can have something, as I just suggested here, that's at once very specific, concrete, particularized, and at the same time a general form, or what Marx calls a universal form of exchange. So that's a quandary. You know, if you're going to have the wealth of those societies where the capitalist mode of production prevails, and already this is a mode of production that is becoming global in its reach, how is it going to accomplish overcoming particular differences of exchange between particular circumstances that would inhere in this feudal mode of subsistence? You know, I make some corn, you make some cotton. You know, how do we set up that term of exchange? And what Marx finds of enormous potential in capitalism is that it makes it possible to have a means, through force largely, through compulsion, of compelling people into these relations of exchange, whereby something outside of them gets recognized as something that brings them into what he calls social intercourse. So if you wanted to say, and this becomes very clear when you read the Communist Manifesto, where you say, why is Marx so excited about capitalism? Why does he call it revolutionary? So that's the answer. He's excited about it because it's revolutionary. Why is it revolutionary? Because it compels people to enter into these relations of mutual association or mutual interdependence. And when I said that what Marx is finding internal or immanent to capitalism is the social ism that it relies upon but disavows, that is the basis. That's the basis of his analysis starting in Volume 1. Is that when he says the wealth, we're going to start with the general wealth, but we must begin with what? We don't begin with capital as such in the abstract. Where does he say we must begin as a method and analytically? Our analysis must begin with the single commodity. So that's precisely that juxtaposition. between the wealth, and the wealth, what does the wealth do? It presents itself as what? As an immense accumulation, right? It presents itself as capitalism, right? You look and you say, oh my goodness, look at all this wealth. It just happens to not be mine, but look at it all. Look at that. Would you look at that apartment on 57th Street, that penthouse? It's $90 million. Wow, that's immense. Right? So that you could say is the teaser of capitalism. Right? There's all this wealth all around, but because of the property relations and because it's accessible only through the money form. But what's interesting is now that money form is claimed to be accessible through these relationships of credit and debt. Through money that isn't in your pocket, but through relations of time and space that you could enter into through, and this is what's I think important to grasp, particular relations of labor. Because when you manage your own retirement portfolio, you are giving your time to make investment decisions that then you're both going to reap the potential rewards of, but also the potential risks of. If you decide, oh, been working for 50 years, can't really do it anymore, I think I'm going to step away from this, and the stock market crashes, that's your problem. And you could say that one of the big things is sometimes what's called neoliberalism, and has a lot to do with the emergence of contemporary finance and the undoing of something called the financial architecture in 1973, when there was a gold-based dollar standard that all the world's currencies were tied to. After the Second World War, pretty much destroyed all of the economies, both friend and foe, and the United States became the banker of last resort and set the terms of exchange for all the world's currencies. This started a ski resort in Mount Washington, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, for people like John Maynard Keynes, and lasted from 1944 till it broke up between 71 and 73. And out of that, when it broke up, instead of a dollar, you had these things called derivatives. And in 1973, there was a formula for pricing what we call options. An option is merely pricing something that wasn't priced before, which is a risk. And the risk is a particular potential gain or loss on an investment. Say that a lot of what bringing finance to labor meant was making derivatives part of people's everyday life experience, and instead of the government being in the Social Security business, they got out of the security business and into the risk business. We could say that, in fact, this is even what the War on Terror represented, was that in the name of security, actually, terror wasn't going to be eliminated, it was going to be produced. And one of the big effects of the War on Terror was not to eliminate terror, but to increase it. Between 2003 and 2007, it was increased sevenfold, the number of terrorist incidents. The other thing that happened is that if the big way of managing populations was not getting people into the middle class through professional credentialing, but sorting out populations between those people who could undertake these risks and benefit from them, and people who came to be called the at-risk. And it's interesting, the history of this goes back to Reagan's attempt to eliminate public education in the Department of Education, and a report was published called A Nation at Risk. And this was in 1983, and it was what introduced all the ranking and grading protocols, and that then met their apotheosis in No Child Left Behind. And the idea was that the domestic population was a security risk, that by failing to meet standards, made the United States compromise in relation to its competitors. At that time it was Japan. But now the idea, and No Child Left Behind is also drawn from military metaphors of not leaving your buddy out in the field. So you would not leave your co-soldier out in the field. You put them around your shoulder. And it's interesting. It's supposedly in the Second World War, there was this big peace dividend, nukes, right, where the technology was imported back into the industrial economy. In Iraq and Afghanistan, it went the other way around. Largely, Apple drove the technology of those wars. And the biggest military technological gain was not shock and awe, but was application of a tourniquet, right, which saved a lot of lives in the field. But one thing that did happen is, even though lives were saved in the field through a very simple technological shift, and this you could say was the input of No Soldier Left Behind. So kids don't flunk out, but they get graded and they get downgraded, and they get constantly now measured and oriented to their own risk exposure, which we could say is one way of bringing this logic of finance, of constantly measuring yourself and your future performance and outcome in relation to a mode of comparison with your value relative to others. And of course, in New York public schools, this is how schools are funded, right? At their capacity to raise their grades relative to other schools in their cohort. Right? And this is also, of course, the way real estate works. This is how subprime worked. So we're seeing the same logic being applied, and this is what the basis of subprime was, which was ninja: no income, no job, no asset, just one's capacity to undertake a certain risk exposure. So this means that the capacity to integrate the work of labor into or production into the circulation of capital, which was once seen, and is one way of thinking about the difference between what's discussed in Volume 1, which is a discussion of the labor process that I know Julie is going to bring you more deeply into. And this is, you would say, where the idea of free wage labor is applied, but also where you get, and you have to appreciate, Marx is writing in the middle of the 19th century in a Victorian era where there's separation between public and private, that he in some ways reinscribes between production and circulation. In fact, he calls the labor process the hidden abode of production. And that hidden abode is also important because it also hides from the worker the relationship between subsistence and surplus. How does it do that? Because wage labor, because we're paid for time instead of for labor. Why? Because we lack the subsistence to translate our capacity, our potential, our power to labor into its realization, into its actualization. That's the problem, and that's the problem with the enclosures and the increase of taxation and the expropriation of lands, is that if people had the means to produce their own means of subsistence, they wouldn't be compelled to work for others. Right? And one of the interesting things about contemporary conditions of precarity is now there's all these forms of free labor. Right? Every time you go on Google, you're performing free labor in which you are producing value for Google or for Facebook or for all kinds of large firms that are in which you're providing your data for free, but they are mining and harvesting that data for billions of dollars of profit to which you can make no monetary claim on.
I'm sorry, can you just, the connection between sort of like wage and time and labor and subsistence, just kind of
Yes,
explain that a little?
absolutely. So first, direct means of subsistence is taken away. So that's what a lot of the enclosures are, or the increase in taxation that pries people away from the old way of living. Right? So one idea of the invisible hand and the rise of capitalism is that people say, "Oh my goodness, the wealth of nations is going to be so cool." Right? I mean, capitalism is efficient, it's rational. It assumes that what I want to do is become a capitalist, and I can do that because I'm free to do it. And so sure, I'll give up my subsistence, because if I work hard enough, I can just save some of the money and then start my own business and then go from a small business person to a large business person. That's the promise. Or, and this is the idea of Keddy's book, Capital in the 21st Century, that as labor increases its share of wealth over capital, and that's his claim, that this happens more or less between about 1912 and 1973, which he says is the historical exception. And the rest of the time, both before and after, capital has reaped the largest share of wealth. Right? So that was a period. And what did that period happen to be? It happened to be a period of emerging and growing labor movements, of socialist and communist parties, of socialist and communist states. Right? In other words, it didn't happen because markets were free. It happened because of all kinds of revolutionary processes, and not just in the first world, but in the third world. And see how potent this seemingly dead socialism, just the specter of it is. I mean, someone like Obama can be considered a socialist, just because even the most modest sounding compromises on capital's freedom, that's what's free, is the freedom against capital's capacity to do what it wants to do and the conditions it wants to do it. So that's where surplus reigns, and where the integration between subsistence and surplus under the sign of finance makes that confusion endemic to contemporary capitalism. Yeah.
I just wanted, you asked me a basic question about like how a certain part of the working day the worker produces the equivalent of the amount of money it takes for you to subsist on, and for another part of the working day, that's when you produce the surplus that goes to create the profit of the bosses and the rents of the landlords. Were you asking for that basic?
No, but that's cool too.
Okay.
Yeah, it was just kind of the like how I guess how labor produces surplus and the
Sure.
difference between that and the.
Julie, you're going to focus on that.
But you go ahead if it's logical to do it now. I'll work around it.
Okay, so let me just give a simple version of it, and then you can go into it.
Don't worry.
Right. So let's just say, and this is interesting too, just to start to think places like Rhode Island, Seattle, is starting to get some of these struggles that are interestingly not happening, although in Washington, D.C., there's some initiatives, but they're happening at municipal levels, not at a national level, even though minimum wage legislation is also, has a national level. But a lot of the gerrymandering of the political landscape in the U.S. Has to do with this question of who has what capacity to set what kind of minimum. It just has to do with this question of subsistence. But hours a week, right? That is a little under $300, about $300, and times 50. That is for a family of four, still under the poverty line. So, and indeed, as wages have been cut, and they've been cut as what's called union density, right, which usually drives the overall wage level, has gone down. Means that more and more people are being pressed into the workforce. This idea that one person could support a household has been illustrated in the past 40 years. It's sort of interesting, too, this thing of the risk-capable versus the at-risk, and the way of attending that in policy terms, which was through domestic war on youth, war on crime, war on drugs, war on culture. This is the and federally mandated prison sentences. A nation at risk meant that no longer were schools simply locally controlled, and a lot of Reagan's political muscle in getting into the White House had to do with using the Christian right and this guy Gary for direct marketing to try and take over local school boards. And this was a strategy for trying to deal with this kind of risk enhancement, right? Which is interesting as well, because it meant taking away the security, but also saying that if you couldn't make it under that regime, the proper way of dealing with this problem was nationalization and federalization, and that's what a lot of the testing regime deals with. Is core standards, again, no child left behind, financing, which is rolled from the federal down to the local levels, which means that if you can't make the grade, you yourself are placed at risk. And you're placed at risk through these regimes of scrutiny and comparison and evaluation. Rather than assuming that if you vest yourself by working for 30 or 40 years, you are going to reap the benefits. So that's where, in terms of the labor process, the wage must be what's called a social wage. Right? It must be adequate, right, to meet your household needs for paying rent, for subsistence. So let's even say generously that you work for 8 hours a day at $10 an hour, and that leads you to make $80 an hour. So let's say that you work at a McDonald's, and let's say that the hamburger sells for $2, and you make 20 an hour. 10 hamburgers an hour. How many hours does it take you to make? I started this example back when minimum wage was $5. My numbers. So how many hours does it take you to make the equivalent of your wage?
How many hamburgers?
If you're making, your wage is 80.
40 hamburgers.
40
2
hours.
hours. 2 hours.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yep. So that would be 2. Let me go back and make this simpler. Yeah. So that would be 4, right? So in other words, in 4 hours, right, you've made your $80. that input is the subsistence for what is the paid proportion of your labor. Right? So the working day is divided between the portion of the working day that you get paid for. Right? So in half the working day, you've made the equivalent of your wage. Now, what about for the other half of the day? Are you getting paid for that? Formally, you are, because you're paid not by the burger, but because you're paid for your time. This would be the manager's response. Well, of course you're getting paid. You get paid for every minute you're here. You check in, you could say, again, that's what's clever about paying you for wage labor as measured by time. Okay? But you could say the cleverness here is that wage labor is a form of capital that Marx calls variable. So, let's say that, so in 4 hours you make the equivalent of your wage. What else do you need to make those burgers? That's very generous of you to say that.
Buns.
Buns, yeah. Let me be less generous and say plastic. So McDonald's needs a lot of plastic. There's the plastic, right, of the meat. There's the plastic of the wrapper. There's the plastic of the seats. There's the plastic that the stuff is fried in, and all those inputs we could say are you use up, let's say, a certain amount of plastic for every burger. Even, how much electricity. You could even say if you've got one of those nice deep fat fryers, more or less, let's say you can imagine that you get a certain number of burners out of every vat of fat, out of the machine itself. It's in accounting terms, it's called amortizing costs, right? You use up a certain amount of the machine. And that Marx understood as what he called constant capital, because it gets used up. Every burger, let's say, takes up a certain amount of those inputs. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So let's just say arbitrarily that if for every 80 burgers worth, 20 burgers worth, right, is constant capital. Okay? And that leaves a third component, which would be what?
Profit.
Profit, right? So that's another...
Mm-hmm. Or surplus, right?
Well, all of this is surplus because it's unpaid.
Mm-hmm.
But not all of the surplus is profit.
Mm-hmm.
But the gain of capital is increasing not just the amount of profit, but what Marx calls the rate of profit. And this is going to be a big deal in Volume 3, the relationship between what he calls the mass of profit. And you increase the mass of profit because you get more and more people doing wage labor and producing for profit. But that doesn't necessarily mean that as you get more and more people doing wage labor, you necessarily increase the rate of profit. And why would you need to do that? Because capital rests upon borrowing money and paying back for the capitalist. For if the McDonald's franchise holder takes out $1 million loan at 10%, then they have to pay back more than they take in. So in a way, capital compels this expansion of the rate of return. And that's what the investors are demanding. That's what competition demands. That's what all of the logic of capitalism as a whole could say requires is an expansion of that rate of profit. So it's not a question of whether you're a nice person or a meanie. If you sign on, this is what you could say the deal is. So how do you do that? That's the question. How do you actually increase the rate of profit?
Yeah, you can decrease the constant part of the surplus. So, less meat, more plastic.